Let me wrap up this section of my talk by pointing out a common theme in the science of fasting for high blood pressure and the science of fasting for rheumatoid arthritis, because it's a theme that also runs across fasting for many other diseases, and it's one reason why fasting hasn't spread more widely. It's this. Over the last century or so, whenever a fasting doctor has said, when I fast my patients with this disease or that disease, they get better, conventional doctors and scientists have ridiculed them as quacks. In their ignorance about fasting's clinical history and the science of its restorative biomechanisms, conventional doctors and scientists have said over and over, you've got no proof, just an anecdote or two, so we're not even going to discuss it. Well, in recent years, as you can see from these stories I've just told you, there goes the voice. As you can see from these stories, fasting doctors and a few scientists, a very few, but still some, have been documenting these reversals of disease, have been discovering some of the mechanisms behind these reversals, and have been offering us the proof. In some cases, they've even gotten the proof published in very prestigious journals like The Lancet. But guess what? It hasn't mattered. The vast majority of doctors and scientists today continue to reject as preposterous the idea that prolonged fasting can heal. Because the sad fact is that although every doctor you meet will claim to practice evidence-based medicine, and every scientist will claim to look at evidence dispassionately, the majority of them simply refuse to examine the mountain of evidence that shows prolonged fasting can reverse disease. It's a deeply unscientific bias. It's profoundly ugly, and it is literally killing people. One reason that I wrote The Oldest Cure in the World was to lay out the pile of evidence so that anyone, doctors and scientists included, who cared to look at the facts dispassionately could do so. But it's the rare doctor or scientist I've come across who will, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. I don't have time right now to go into why doctors and scientists are so biased against fasting, but I'd be happy to discuss it in the Q&A if anyone wants to pursue it. Okay, the last thing I want to share with you is about fasting for mental and neurological health. And for this, I'm going to tell you a little of my own story. I first started fasting about 20 years ago, and I did so for fasting's somatic benefits, that is, benefits to the body. Partly, I was impressed with the research that showed that fasting made lab animals live nearly twice as long in the best cases. The effect on longevity impressed me hugely. Partly also, I just wanted to lose some weight. I've since come to realize that fasting can be a useful adjunct to weight loss, but it's not enough by itself. If you want to lose weight, diet is certainly the most important variable. You will lose weight, of course, if you do a prolonged fast. But if you just go back to eating the unhealthy diet that gave you the excess weight in the first place, as I did for many years, you'll just put the weight back on. Anyway, it never occurred to me to try to use fasting to improve my mental or neurological health, just my physical health. And mostly that's because there was almost nothing in the literature of fasting that suggested it could improve psychiatric health, at least not beyond, just kind of making you a little calmer and maybe a bit more contemplative, which religious fasters have known for millennia. The lack of information about fasting for mental health was a real shame in my case, because I really could have used it. And that's because in my early 20s, I was a psychological train wreck. I became clinically depressed soon after leaving college, and for decades, I didn't find a cure. Fortunately, or somewhat fortunately, my depression was kept in check by drugs, Prozac, Paxil, Wellbutrin, on and on. But there were two big problems with the drugs. One was that they didn't cure the depression. They just managed the symptoms. And because of that, the second problem was that they always stopped working after a time. I would inevitably crash, become deeply depressed, and my psychiatrists and I would have to scramble to find another drug that would work for a few more years. As the decades went by, these crashes grew deeper and deeper to the point where I was nearly suicidal. And even in the good times, my mood grew more and more unstable, and I became more and more fragile. I also gradually developed a handful of other psychiatric and neurological disorders. I will spare you most of them, but I'll tell you about one that started with an overwhelming fatigue, which at first I didn't think much of, but over the years it came more and more often. Some days I would sit down to write, and within an hour my mind would fog over, and the rest of the day would be a running battle with exhaustion. Weirdly, when I tried to nap, I could rarely sleep, and when I did sleep, I woke up totally unrefreshed. Sometimes the fatigue was so overwhelming that I just simply had to abandon writing for days or even weeks. I was constantly irritable with my wife and son. I couldn't contribute much around the house. I was a pretty lousy friend, just utterly undependable. Eventually, I was diagnosed with a rare neurological disorder called idiopathic hypersomnia, although that wasn't much of a diagnosis. Hypersomnia just means you're tired all the time, which I already knew, and idiopathic means scientists and doctors have no clue why you have the disease, and they certainly have no cure. But even though the disorder isn't well defined, it's a severe disease. Some poor people with idiopathic hypersomnia sleep 12, 16, even 20 hours a day, and they don't wake up refreshed. So nearly every waking hour, they're stumbling around feeling what the rest of us feel in those few moments right before sleep, those moments when you can barely keep your eyelids open. My hypersomnia wasn't usually that bad, but it was plenty bad enough, and it was getting worse by the year. The only thing my doctors could give me to treat it were stimulants, which were basically legal amphetamines. Those did keep me awake, but they made me even more irritable, as well as jittery and anxious. They also wrecked my sleep, which made me even more dependent upon the stimulants. So for years, I got up each morning and I had to choose between the poison of the disease and the poison of the drug. It was just awful. Given all this, it was no surprise that in my 40s, I'm 52 now, my memory began to fail. I'm pretty sure I was experiencing the very beginning of what doctors call mild cognitive impairment, which is often the first diagnosable step toward dementia. Despite the name, it's anything but mild. It's just called that because it's milder than dementia. Eventually, I got to the point where I was utterly unable to research or write. My career ground to a halt, and I was a disaster in a dozen different ways. What saved me was a bit of good luck that came in an unlikely disguise. Over the holidays at the end of 2018, I put on some weight, and the following January, I fasted to help get the weight off. I had zero intention of fasting for mental or neurological well-being. I just wanted to undo my gluttony. But a few days into my fast, I noticed I wasn't as exhausted as I normally was during the daytime. I didn't think too much about it at first because my hypersomnia had always waxed and waned. I'd have a good 2 or 3 days, then I'd be back in hell for 3 or 4 weeks, then I'd have another spurt of good days, and so on. But more days passed during my fast without my feeling tired, and eventually I realized I had just spent a whole week free of hypersomnia for the first time in a decade. It still kind of almost makes me tear up. Some of my other pathologies seemed to improve during my fast as well. I definitely became more alert and less irritable. I was a better contributor around the house. I was more able to exercise. I just felt overall healthier. And for the first time in a long time, I was so very glad just to be alive. It truly felt like a form of rebirth. During the 2 weeks of my fast, I had changed nothing else about my life that I'm aware of. So it seemed to me it had to be the fast that was behind my revitalization. But great as all that was, my recovery raised a rather pressing concern, which was the question of how could I maintain that recovery once I started eating again? See, once I started getting better, I had the same thought that those old fasting doctors that I had mentioned had, the ones who asked, well, if the disease goes away when we take the food away, is it possible that something in the food was contributing to or outright causing the disease? And if so, in my case, what might those problem foods be? Frankly, I was scared stiff by these questions. I feared that my recovery might prove a Cinderella at the ball kind of thing, that when I broke my fast, I would eat something that would bring my disorders rushing back. In an attempt to avoid that fate, I looked into what fasting doctors had to say about refeeding. And one person I turned to, in a manner of speaking, was Dr. Alan Goldhammer at True North. Several years earlier, I had interviewed Goldhammer for an article that I was writing about fasting. As I looked back through my notes of the interview, I now saw that he had said that although fasting could chase a lot of diseases into remission, the diseases usually returned if the patient didn't adopt a diet of unrefined plants. Now, at the time I interviewed him, I had been sympathetic to Goldhammer. I wasn't vegan myself, and the truth is, I didn't really want to hear this part of his prescription. My article was about the breathtaking cures that fasting could achieve. It wasn't about cures that disintegrated unless you made a lifelong change to the way you ate. So I didn't entirely bury his recommendation to eat a minimally processed vegan diet in the article that I wrote, but I didn't draw undue attention to it either. Looking back now, I felt foolish and quite ashamed about that. But even a fool can learn. So after I poked around in the very convincing science of whole food veganism, I decided to give it a go when I broke my fast. Sure enough, when I refed, my hypersomnia stayed away. Meal after meal, it just didn't come back. The same was true for my other disorders that had diminished during my fast. And as I continued to eat the vegan diet afterward, it seemed to deepen my cures. At least I gained more and more energy. My mood reached new heights. I was less and less irritable. I could remember more things, and I was able to research and write again. A month after breaking my fast, I became bold enough to wean myself off my antidepressant. In the past, when I had gone off my meds, I'd always suffered psychological collapse within months. But this time there was no implosion. Pretty soon, I got rid of other pills. I got rid of the Xanax for anxiety, the Lunesta for sleep, the stimulants for wakefulness, and on until the shelf in the bathroom that once held all my prescriptions was empty. This was all fantastic, but I confess I was in a state of some disbelief. Surely getting rid of decades of disease, all that misery and helplessness, all those doctors and drugs, surely it couldn't be as easy as just fasting a couple of weeks and then eating plants. It had to be more complicated than that, right? But it wasn't. It's been over 4 years now, and I'm still cured, or at least in one heck of a remission. After I got better, I started to research whether there were any studies or historical accounts of other mentally or neurologically ill people who also got better through fasting. There were virtually no peer-reviewed studies, but the historical record of the last 2-3 centuries did turn out to have several stories of people who claimed, anyway, to have used prolonged fasting, often for multiple weeks, to reverse psychiatric diseases. These included severe depression and some forms of what 100 or so years ago was usually just called insanity or madness. Most of these were isolated cases, the odd case here or there in a madhouse or possibly at home. But there was one big exception, and that was the work of a Russian psychiatrist named Yuri Nikolaev, who I ended up writing a chapter about in my book. Yuri Nikolaev was born in the early 1900s. And he grew up in a family that sometimes fasted when they got sick. When he became a psychiatrist in the Soviet Union, he at first treated his most severely mentally ill patients with the same sort of barbaric treatments that were common everywhere in the mid-20th century. Treatments like electroshocks, insulin shocks, which were meant to reboot the brain, but which all too often just totally fried it. Eventually, Nikolaev decided these therapies did more harm than good, and in 1948, he decided to fast some of his patients at the mental hospital in Moscow where he worked. The results were spectacular. Hardcore schizophrenics, people who were very severely deranged and who had seen beyond all help, often completely recovered on a fast of nothing but water. Over about 4 decades, Nikolaev fasted perhaps 10,000 patients, mostly schizophrenics. And his method was simple but interesting. The first thing to know is that unlike other psychiatrists, Nikolaev quickly learned not to force his treatment on people. He found that when he tried making people fast against their will, they rebelled and became more agitated and deranged. So it seems as though he always got the permission of the patient first, although sometimes there was a little benevolent subterfuge involved. For example, many schizophrenics think they have something physically wrong with them, right? They imagine that they have deformed facial features or that they're overrun with bacteria, so they have to wash their hands 6 hours a day. So Nikolaev would say to them, well, we think fasting will help you get better. So would you like to fast? And he didn't mind that the patient thought he meant that fasting would get rid of their deformed nose or would chase away all those bacteria. A lot of patients said yes. So Nikolaev would fast them, as I said, on nothing but water. Interestingly, he often found that during the first week of their fasts, the symptoms of their illness grew worse. That's true for somatic diseases of the body as well. On longer fasts, often the symptoms grow worse at first. Doctors refer to it as a healing crisis. But when the patients had reached about 10 days of fasting, the symptoms usually began to dissipate and they became calmer, almost sedated in some cases. Typically, he would fast a patient about a month. And before the month was up, the last of the patient's deliriums, hallucinations, and other troubles usually disappeared. Like most other fasting doctors of the last century, Nikolaev refed his patients on a vegetarian diet. And he noticed that when they refed, they usually became even calmer, although, of course, many of them were overjoyed to be free of their disease. He reported restoring nearly 70% of his fasters to full functioning when they walked out of his hospital. That is an awfully impressive rate, given that he was dealing with a pretty hopeless pool, 3/4 of whom were severely schizophrenic and nearly all of whom had failed other treatments. The real test, though, came when his patients got back home. To maintain their remissions, Nikolaev advised them to keep eating a vegetarian diet, the one he put them on, and to avoid alcohol, caffeine, tobacco, and fried and salty foods. He also asked them to do periodic maintenance fasts of, I think it was about 3 to 5 days at a time, up to 10 total days a month. In the Soviet Union of that era, health professionals followed up on psychiatric inpatients for up to 10 years after they were discharged, with visits both at home and at work. So Nikolaev probably had a better idea than most Western psychiatrists of his day about how well his method worked over the long term. He reported that at his patients' 6-year follow-ups, half of the ones who had left the hospital cured were still completely cured, and another 15% maintained part of their remission. So about 2/3 of his patients still enjoyed substantial improvements 6 years after treatment, which again is a great success in so desperate a population. Nikolaev came to believe that there were two factors that best predicted his patients' long-term success. One was how closely the patient followed the vegetarian diet, and the other was how long the patient had been sick before their fast.